After a hell of a long time waiting, DLSS is finally in Escape from Tarkov, and that means everyone with a 20 series or higher GPU from NVIDIA should be able to get max FPS in Tarkov, right? Well, maybe not so much. I've done quite a bit of testing today, and it's a mixed bag, let's put it that way. Now, I'm not saying that your mileage won't vary in this, and it's 100% worthwhile turning on in the settings if you have a 2060 graphics card from NVIDIA or higher, and going into Raid and trying it out for yourself. When you go into your settings, you'll get a few options straight out of the bat. If you're using a 1080p monitor or higher, you will receive two options here. You'll get quality or balanced. If you're using a 1440p monitor or higher, then you will get an extra option in there for performance. And if you're using a 4K monitor, you'll get another performance option called ultra performance. Now, on paper, these options are self-explanatory. The quality option will give you the better quality without giving you too much of an FPS increase, and so on and so forth, all the way down to the performance and ultra performance, where you'll see a dip in the quality of the game, but you'll get a larger FPS increase. In theory. In terms of reality, I don't think DLSS has been implemented too well at all. And this is not me hating on BSG for the implementation, of course this is just day one. I'm just saying it how I see it, because if we don't mention these things, then these won't be brought up as an issue and they won't get fixed in future updates. Now, in terms of testing, what did I do? Well, the first thing is I cranked up my game settings all the way to the maximum that Tarkov allows it. Everything was on ultra, with the exception of noise, because that's just disgusting and no one would have it on anyway. And then I went into loads of different raids. I went into Lighthouse and Customs, and also tested this on a few other maps, but the reason I use Lighthouse and Customs as a prime example is because these are the maps that they used to showcase DLSS in their announcement trailer a couple of weeks ago. From there, I played the raid, but I made sure I did a few things very similar in each raid. I made sure I walked down a long straight road or a long straight path. This allows us to see a long distance down the map, and obviously if you're looking down the longer section of the map rather than the shorter section, you will see a decrease in frames because of the amount that your game is rendering in. I also aimed down sight with a variable zoom optic, and this was to test how much improvement we got on the frames when we used picture-in-picture to render the magnification of the optic itself. And then finally, I tried to get into a firefight, either that be a II Scav or a PMC, whatever I found first, because usually a firefight, either gunshots or grenades going off, will decrease the FPS in your game. And of course, we did this for every DLSS option available. We did this for off, quality, balanced, and performance on all maps. And we didn't just do this with my system using the 3090 GPU, we also had people with 20 series test this out for us, and other people with 30 series cards as well. I've had a lot of help from the community, and it's been massively important for this test. And I'd also like to point out, for all those people that like to go on Twitter and call people out for being wrong on things, that all of these tests were taken on either 1440p or 4K monitors, because that is what DLSS is made for. As I've said before, DLSS does work with 1080p monitors, but you wouldn't expect too much of an increase in performance there. It's made for upscaling HD resolutions to Ultra HD resolutions. Just bear that in mind. So on our first test, we went onto Lighthouse, turned DLSS off, and walked down the highway as we mentioned, getting the longest distance across the map possible to be rendered in. On my system with the RTX 3090, we were getting lows of 83 FPS, highs of 89, and a middle ground of 85 FPS when walking down the road. When we scoped in, it dropped around 20 FPS respectively, and we were getting a 60 FPS average with a high of 65 FPS when aiming down sights. No artifacting, nothing like that. Everything was clear and crisp whether we were walking, sprinting, or aiming down sights, and it was a nice visual experience. The frames were not the best, but this is with DLSS off, so we'll use this as a baseline. And of course, we encountered some PvP that I did not win, but to be fair, the frame rate stayed pretty consistent. I was in a forested area at the time of the engagement, so the FPS was actually higher than walking down the long highway. So we dipped from 90 to 85, wasn't a massive deal, died anyway, didn't really matter. Turning DLSS onto quality and then going back into Lighthouse and walking down that same highway area, we got much more of a varied result. We got lower lows, better middles and higher highs in terms of FPS. So walking down the road without scoping in, lows were around 80 and then highs were about 94, which is okay. The range is a bit more of a jittery issue because it kept going up and down, it wasn't very stable, but then you aim down sights and it dips to 50, which is lower than what I was expecting when it was off. So 55 was our baseline really, and then highs of 57 when we scope in. And I also noticed when looking at foliage in a variable zoomed scope, you see much more of a splotchy image. It isn't as clear and it looks more like an oil painting when you're aiming down sights. You also got a lot more pop in. If you look around the sides of this clip here, you can see the rocks and the gravel popping in quite a bit more than you did with it off. Wasn't what I was expecting at all really, but of course this is the quality setting. It does look good. Other than a few visual artifacts, you don't really notice much of a difference close up. It's only further away and when you're aiming down sights that you'll really notice a difference. And this was tested on 1440p and a 4K monitor, and the experiences were exactly the same. Going back into the lighthouse map with the quality of DLSS turned to balance now, and it was a very similar situation. We got 87 FPS just walking down the road on average with lows of like 83. When we aimed down sights it was a 55 to 57 FPS, and then when engaged in combat it dipped to around 50 again. So it's very similar to how the quality setting was. And in terms of visual artifacts, you saw them a lot closer up, and it wasn't too much of an eyesore this time. Rather than the pop-in being quite drastic pretty far away, you were getting pop-in but it was quite close to you. You can see this quite a lot on the ridges of the gun model that I'm using. You can see the flickers on the lighting. Of course you've got the trees that look like oil paintings again, and you've got a few different dirt and gravel effects that you're seeing which shouldn't be there. But that being said, it doesn't actually look as bad as quality. It's sure your overall look's going to be lower, your FPS is pretty much the same, but in terms of pop-ins and obvious artifacts that you can see really sort of nastily and in your face, they're not there as much, which is okay, but it seems a bit backwards, doesn't it? Now turning things down to performance in terms of DLSS quality and then going back into Lighthouse is where we saw FPS increases but massive visual issues, as we were to be expecting really, because performance is sacrificing your quality for the most FPS possible. But in terms of quality, everything blends in. The color palette just washes away after 100 meters, so you can't see anything in shadows or anything in foliage. That combined when you aim down sights, things go darker anyway, and then trying to look into any sort of foliage with that oil painting effect, which gets even worse the lower you downgrade your DLSS, it's just impossible to see anything. But the brighter side, you get averages of 90 FPS while walking down this lighthouse highway, and it dips to about 70 when you're aiming down sights. So if you want the extra 10 FPS to not see anything, then be my guest. But in my view, on any system we tested, this didn't look very good at all. And on average, we were getting a 15% increase over DLSS being turned on and turned off. It's not a massive deal, and you're not going to see a night and day FPS increase anyway, and the lack of quality in your image is really going to affect you seeing players at further distances, especially on an open map like Lighthouse anyway. Moving over to customs now, with DLSS turned off, we were getting an average of 105 to 112 FPS while walking down the long road by Ice Cream by the construction area, looking all the way down to where the new gas station is and that bridge. Now when you aim down sight, you see another decrease in FPS. That's obvious. We got another 20 FPS drop. It went down to 90, 95 FPS when aiming down sight along that road. Again, as to be expected, it's something that we've been dealing with for quite some time. It's also to be expected with picture-in-picture anyway. You're rendering the image pretty much twice. You've got the 1x image, the normal image that you're seeing around your scope, and then you've got the magnified image being rendered again inside the scope as well. So it's to be expected, and to be fair, on customs, 90 FPS completely playable, especially on max settings. Now turning DLSS on and putting it to quality and then going back into customs, I would have said that this clip that you're seeing on screen was an anomaly because of the FPS was actually quite a lot lower, but on all the systems we tested on, all of the FPS was coming in at a similar result, so I just thought I'd use this clip to show you that weather doesn't actually make that much of a difference with DLSS on. So when we're walking down the road, we're getting around 90, 95 FPS when we're walking down the road. When we aim down sight though, we are getting just over 60, almost 70 FPS when we're aiming down sight. Not as good as we were getting before, that's for sure. It dipped quite a bit when aiming down sight, and again, if you look at the foliage, especially when you are zoomed out on your variable zoom scope, you can see the oil pastel effect, the sort of splotchiness in the actual foliage. Not great. Not as much pop in on this map though. This map is smaller, so the only visual artifacts that you were really seeing were the ones on the weapon itself and the lighting effects that you were seeing, especially if it was slightly gloomier conditions or there was reflections going on in the image. Actually, now watching these clips back, I'm wondering if anyone that was in my raid saw me and thought I was a scav, because I was literally walking up and down this road on customs for quite some time getting an average FPS result, but that's by the by. Moving on to balanced on our DLSS settings now, we actually saw a little bit of an increase in FPS. We got around 120 FPS on average, and that wasn't too bad at all. But I don't know what was going on here. Again, when we aimed down sight, you saw a massive decrease in FPS all the way down to 66, and then only when you started to move around, it started to stabilize in the 70s in terms of FPS. Not ideal, and again, this was happening on both 4K and 1440p displays that we were testing on. So a bit strange, considering this wasn't even happening on Lighthouse, but again, not unplayable frame rates, just a bit crazy to actually see. Turning DLSS on to performance now, and then going back into customs. On that same road, walking up and down it, we did see a slight improvement in FPS, up to 130 it peaked at. But in terms of the normal averages and lows, we were getting 118, 100, 110, all of that mark, and it was fluctuating quite a bit. When we aim down sights, again, a pretty substantial decrease, however, not as bad. It was dipping to 80 rather than its 60s, and when I was testing, some guy tried to jump over that little wall there, and I missed him with the shot, but then I just threw the grenade for a little bit of fun, and he couldn't get out of the bush quick enough, bless him. But in terms of the actual decrease in FPS when that was all being thrown, the explosion did actually decrease our FPS down to 60 for a brief second, so expect that to still be occurring. Other than that though, no visual issues in the distance. Again, this map is quite small in comparison to Lighthouse. The only real issue is the foliage, because there's so much of it in terms of grass and trees. You will see this quite a bit even when you're not aiming down sights, especially at a little distance away. Not right up in your face, but at a little distance you will start seeing that pastel-y sort of effect, and when you're aiming down sights it just doesn't look good at all. So now you've seen the FPS averages that I've taken from my system. In terms of the systems that we also tested on, like the 20 series GPUs, 2070 Super, etc., we didn't actually see that much of a varying difference. We were getting 20% increases roughly, depending whether we turned DLSS on or off, but the visuals were just as bad as we saw with our 30 series card, and the visuals are my main gripe with it. Now sure, at lower resolutions you expect this, but at 1440p and 4K you don't really get the ghosting, the pixelization, the color merging and all that you've seen in this video. Now it's not life or death, and like I've said, your mileage will vary in terms of what you see in DLSS. But in my eyes, this definitely needs some tweaking. I'm not the only people that experience these sorts of issues. I've asked around the community, and obviously I've had people help me with these tests running the same situations that I've ran here, and just generally playing with DLSS on for the day. All of us saw that FPS increase over the course of playing. Sure, some of our tests were just looking down the longest route possible to get the most rendered in, and not the most ideal situations. Through playing in general, you did get a few more FPS than just looking down a long road and aiming down sight for a little while. And through PvP, you didn't lose that much FPS, but it wasn't worthwhile having it on and losing that crispness of the image. You didn't get the pastel effects and you didn't get the color merging when you had this off, but when you have it on, you do. Now I'm sure for some people this wouldn't matter to them. If they can't hardly run Lighthouse at more than 20 FPS, then sure, turn that shit on as quick as you can, because if you're just going to be running rogues or trying to do your missions there, then a little bit of popping in and stuff like that you will get used to. And the main gripe with a lot of people, including myself to some extent, is it's not what we're used to and not what we expected. Especially from the trailer that they were showing, it looked crystal clear on every setting really, without much of a dip in the quality, and that's not what we see in reality. But that being said, it will change over time and hopefully for the better. So thank you so much for tuning into this video. Let me know what you think of it down below in the comments, and let me know if you think I'm wrong about anything. But don't just say I'm wrong, tell me why as well and let me know your experience. Let's have a proper conversation. Even send me some clips on Twitter or something, tag me in some stuff. I'd love to see what your experiences are with DLSS so far. Thank you so much for watching this video anyway. Enough of me rambling. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.